Welcome to the next lesson in this chapter, where we are transitioning from a modular monolith to a microservices architecture. The next component that we are going to introduce into our system is an API gateway, and we are going to use a reverse proxy library called YARP to implement a reverse proxy to start out, and then we're going to transition that into a proper API gateway. Let's mention a few responsibilities of API gateways and try to figure out how they might be different from reverse proxies. The way I like to look at it is an API gateway is just a specialized type of reverse proxy, and the reverse proxy is a server that sits in front of our backend servers and just routes any incoming traffic into these services. So this is also what an API gateway does, but an API gateway has some additional responsibilities such as request routing and composition. It can also handle authentication and authorization, as well as load balancing, rate limiting, and caching. This is what our system is going to look like when we are done with this lesson, and we are going to introduce an additional component that we're going to call the Evently Gateway, and is going to serve as an entry point for client applications into our system. And for now, the API gateway is just going to route any incoming requests to the respective endpoints inside of our modular monolith. As I said, we are going to implement this using YARP, so let me show you what that implementation is going to look like. We are going to start the practical part of this lesson by introducing a new project into our solution. This is going to be an ASP.NET Core Web API, and I'm going to call it Evently Gateway. It's going to be a .NET 8 API. I'm going to enable Docker, and I won't be needing OpenAPI support for my Gateway API. Now let's go ahead and create this project. And this is going to scaffold an empty ASP.NET Core application. We're going to be using this Docker file to run our gateway inside of the Docker Compose setup, and our gateway will not need any references to the existing projects inside of our solution. This also means that I'm going to be copying some setup that I already have in the existing API project. And let's start our gateway implementation by cleaning up the program file. I'm going to clean up the many compiler warnings I'm seeing here and get rid of this default endpoint. And this is all that I need for now inside of the program file. Let's also add container orchestrator support for the Evently Gateway project, and I'm going to say that we're going to target the Linux operating system. If I open up the Docker Compose YAML file, you will see that an additional service was added at the bottom of our configuration, and let me move it just below the Evently API. Now I'm going to give this container a name, and let's call it the Evently Gateway. And then I'm going to configure some ports for the API gateway. Let's say I want to expose it on the ports 3000 and 3001. And this should be enough to start the API gateway when we start the Evently application through Docker Compose. Notice that the two ASP.NET Core applications that we have are sharing internal ports, but this isn't a problem because they're going to be running inside of separate Docker containers in the Docker network. What's important is that we expose them on different external ports, which are going to be available on localhost. This is all we need inside of our Docker setup. Now let's go ahead and install some NuGet packages into the Evently Gateway project. And I want to install Serilog ASP.NET Core as well as the sync for Seek. So I'm going to look for Serilog Seek, and then let me install the Seek sync. I'm also going to install the JWT Bearer NuGet package so that I can configure authentication on my gateway. Let's go ahead and also configure OpenTelemetry. So I'm going to install OpenTelemetry extensions hosting. I'm also going to install the OpenTelemetry exporter, as well as the instrumentation for the HTTP client and the ASP.NET Core instrumentation. And then the most important NuGet package that I need is YARP. I'm going to install YARP Reverse Proxy, and let's add the latest version. And this is the NuGet package that's going to allow us to convert the Evently Gateway API into a reverse proxy for our system. I'm also going to update any existing NuGet packages that I have, which is the Microsoft Visual Studio Container Tools. So let's go ahead and update that. And this should be all of the NuGet packages that we need. Now let's start taking some existing code from our program file in the Evently API and start configuring our reverse proxy. I'm going to set up Serilog in the same way that I'm configuring it in the Evently API project, and I can get rid of this comment now. Then I'm going to configure the YARP services, and I'm going to say builder services add reverse proxy. We're going to provide the reverse proxy setup from the application settings. So I'm going to call load from config, and then I can pass in the respective configuration section. So I'm going to say builder configuration, and let's say get section, and I will call this section reverse proxy. The next thing I want to introduce is my OpenTelemetry setup, and I'm going to reuse some of the code that I have inside of my infrastructure configuration class. So let's go ahead and find this piece of code here, and then I'm going to copy it, and let's reuse it in the Evently gateway setup. So I'm going to paste this code here. Let's introduce the builder services, add the required namespaces, and then let's get rid of the EF core instrumentation, the Redis instrumentation, the MPG SQL instrumentation, and the mass transit source. And I'm going to replace this with the YARP reverse proxy source, which is going to introduce some YARP traces. Then I need to specify my service name, and let's do that in the same way as I was doing in the Evently API project. So I'm going to add a diagnostics config object, and let's update the namespace to Evently gateway. And of course, I'm going to change the service name to also be Evently gateway. Now, if I go back to my program file, I can say diagnostics config and pass in the service name. The next thing I want to do is to also configure authentication on my reverse proxy, because I don't want to allow unauthenticated requests to make it to the Evently API project. And let's also reuse the setup that we have for authentication inside of our common project. So this is going to be the code inside of the call to add authentication internal. So I'm going to copy this, and let's add it right under the reverse proxy setup. I'm going to update services to builder services, and we won't be needing the call to add HTTP context accessor. So I'm going to remove that, and let's reuse the JWT bearer configure options class. So I'm going to introduce an authentication folder inside of my gateway project, and inside of it I'm going to add this class. Let's also refactor this namespace. So I'm going to say refactor, adjust namespaces, and move it to the Evently gateway namespace. Now if I go back to the program file, I can add a using statement, and this is enough to set up authentication on the reverse proxy. I'm going to close down a few files that I won't need anymore, and then let's grab a few more things from the Evently API project. I want to take the middleware that we have inside, and I want to be reusing the global exception handler. So let's get rid of that. And I'm going to adjust the namespace for this folder. And now let's configure some middleware. I'm going to get rid of the HTTPS redirection, and I'm going to say use log context trace logging. Then I'm going to introduce Serilog request logging. The first one here is our custom middleware, which is the log context trace logging middleware, and it's going to include the trace ID as part of the log context, and we're going to grab this value from the current activity if it exists. Now let's also introduce the authentication and authorization middleware. So I'm going to say use authentication and then use authorization. And finally, let's map the reverse proxy, and this is our complete setup for the reverse proxy. The next thing that we are missing is the actual setting values in our app settings JSON file. So let's also take those from the application settings project. We're going to need the authentication section. I can get rid of the keycloak section, and we will also need the Serilog section and the exporter endpoint. So let's go ahead and introduce that. I'm going to get rid of this logging section because I will be using the Serilog one, and let's go ahead and paste this in. I'm going to update the application name to Evently Gateway, and then let's introduce the settings from App Settings Development JSON. I will take these same sections and add them to the respective App Settings Development JSON in the Gateway project. So let's open up that file and add these settings. So I'm going to get rid of keycloak in both of my configuration files, and the config values inside of the gateway are going to be pretty much the same. The authentication section is going to take care of connecting to keycloak. I can remove these log filters for my outbox and inbox jobs, and I'm going to update the Serilog setting to specify Evently Gateway as the application name. You can also see that we are configuring the OpenTelemetry exporter to export our traces to Jaeger. So this takes care of the basic setup of our gateway project. We configured structured logging and set it up to export the logs to Seek. We also configured token-based authentication, and we configured it to connect to Keycloak, and we also set up OpenTelemetry and distributed tracing. And now we get to the most important part, which is our reverse proxy setup. I'm going to add a respective reverse proxy section in the app settings JSON file, and what we need to configure YARP, which stands for yet another reverse proxy, is first of all a reverse proxy section, and then it needs to have two values inside. the routes, which is going to help us configure the incoming request to the reverse proxy, and then we have the cluster section, which is going to represent our downstream services. I'm going to close down the app settings JSON file and add the same section in app settings development JSON, where we are going to configure the actual values. Let me also close the Evently API project, and I can also close the program file of the Evently API. Let's start from the cluster section, where we are going to define our downstream service, which is at this point only Evently API. We have to give our cluster a descriptive name, so I'm going to call this the Evently cluster, and then we need to assign the destinations, which represents the URIs where we can reach this cluster. We can have one or many destinations. I'm going to call this the destination 1, and we need to assign a respective address for this destination. So this is going to point to my Evently API instance, but it's really important that I point this to the instance running inside of the Docker network. And this is going to be HTTP Evently API, and then the HTTP port